The information contained in this podcast is an expression of opinion and does not constitute investment advice. This is the Gold Money Podcast with Andy Duncan, keeping you up to date with expert opinion on precious metals and the markets.
Welcome to this Gold Money Podcast on Wednesday, the 23rd of January. Today I'm with Professor Mark Thornton, who is a senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Alabama, book review editor of the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, and the author and editor of many excellent books, including one of my personal favourites, a republication of Richard Cantillon's seminal masterpiece, an essay on economic theory, which I'm holding in my hands right now. Hello, Mark.
Hello, it's great to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Some prominent Austrian school economists, such as Bob Murphy, have recently been criticised by Keynesians for predicting high inflation, even though price inflation, as calculated by the US government, doesn't seem to have gone up very much, even if we look at the John Williams Shadowstats site, where it's not in the kind of Zimbabwean kind of hyperinflation territory. Now, you recently wrote an article on Mises.org which spoke about this. Can you tell us what you said in the article?
Certainly. Yes, Bob had a bet with David Henderson, predicting that CPI inflation, consumer price index inflation, would exceed 10% by January 1st of 2013. And of course, Bob lost the bet. The problem with the bet was that it was based on CPI inflation as measured by the government. Of course, you mentioned there's problems with that measure, even measuring consumer prices. But what we found this time around is that at present, all of that monetary inflation is creating price inflation in things like gold and oil and other commodities as well. If you look at the producer price index for commodities, you can see it's shot up to all-time highs. The price of gold is close to all-time highs. The price of oil is at a significant high by historical standards. And so when we look at just basic commodities out there, we see that the monetary inflation is causing a significant, much greater than 10% inflation. And of course, the government, as they measure consumer prices, they always have a strong incentive to under-account for inflation. And so they're constantly changing the measure. It used to be a cost of goods index. Now it's a cost of living index, so that as we change our habits and buying behaviors, what happens is that we stop buying high-priced goods that are going up and up and up. We buy lower priced goods that tend to go down, down, and down. And so the government switches the rising prices, the goods that have rising prices, switches them out of the basket and switches into the basket the goods that are lower prices and falling prices. So it's a very inaccurate measure of inflation in the economy. And so my article basically tries to show that we really are having inflation in terms of prices as well as the money supply. It's just not showing up in the government's measure of consumer prices.
Where are the figures for inflation showing up then, if they're not showing up in the CPI?
Well, as I show in the article, they're showing up all over the place. They're certainly showing up in terms of the price of oil, which affects everybody. As the price of gasoline goes up, as the price of energy and heating goes up, of course, we have to buy less of other things. And as a consequence, the price of other things has not gone up. So you have higher oil prices, higher energy prices. You have a significant high price in terms of gold, other commodities. The producer price index for commodities is at an all-time record high. And so, central banks have been increasing the money supply significantly, and it's showing up in world commodity prices as well. We can also see higher prices in things like artwork, contemporary artwork. That market is on fire, all-time record prices for artists, all-time record auctions. And so money is out there, and money is trying to find a hedge against inflation. And so we're seeing, monetary inflation, people trying to get around inflation, people trying to hedge against inflation. We even see it, right where the money gets injected into the economy. In New York City, where the New York banks are, and in Washington, D.C., the real estate markets in those two cities are at record levels. And so there are prices that are going up all over the economy. And it's just not being picked up in the government's measure of consumer price inflation.
Now, one of the obvious places for people to go to hedge inflation is to buy gold. Now, the price of gold has been stagnating for a while, for about a year now. It's kind of been slipping between $1,650 and $1,750 and so on. Given that the fundamentals for gold seem so obviously good, is there any particular reason you can think of why gold is stagnating, or do you just think it's the calm before the monetary storm?
I would go with the latter, that it's calm before the monetary storm. In fact, gold prices could dip down, especially if there's a crisis in the overall economy. You might see a temporary slippage in the price of gold. I'm looking for new opportunities to buy gold in 2013. But ultimately, the price of gold is erratic because the value of the dollar is erratic, and the supply and the demand for dollars is very erratic in the last few years. And so gold is correspondingly also been erratic in the opposite direction. But ultimately, what the Fed has been doing over the last several years and what it has announced it's going to continue to do, which is inflate the money supply, that long term, gold looks like it's in a good position going forward.
Now, it seems that the Federal Reserve's policy is to preserve all of the kind of mega banks, no matter how badly run or inefficient they are, and also to keep funding US government $1 trillion annual deficits to infinity and beyond. How do you think this is all going to end in the United States?
Yeah, you're right. It's not helicopter Ben so much as it is bailout Ben Bernanke, that is. A lot of the benefits of his policies have basically gone to the large banks. You've got 12 mega banks in the United States and then thousands of smaller banks. And all of the benefits of Bernanke's policies have basically been directed at those large banks, which he considers, too big to fail and systemic risks and so on and so forth. But he's really been bailing them out, so that's been his policy. He wrote his dissertation on the Great Depression and how, the failure of banks caused the Great Depression. Whereas Friedman said it was a decline in the money supply. And of course, Rothbard said that it was the inflation of the 1920s that basically mandated that you'd have some kind of depression or recession at some point in time. So Bernanke is going to continue on. He's going to continue to help the big banks. He's going to continue to buy U.S. government securities. He's going to continue to buy mortgage-backed securities, funding, most of the mortgage market in the United States. And he plans to do this for an infinite period of time or until unemployment gets below a certain figure. This is a very dangerous type of policy regime. If we had taken our medicine when this crisis began in 2007, it would have all been over with by now, long ago. And we would be talking about the crisis of 2007, which ended in 2008 and is a thing of the past. Whereas Bernanke's policies, just like Roosevelt's policies in the 1930s, just kept the crisis going, kept unemployment high, and kept real estate markets in disarray. The longer he does this, the more pain he's inflicting on the population of the United States. And of course, his graduate school buddy, Mario Draghi in Europe, is basically doing the same thing. And so it's MIT PhDs who looks like they're going to ruin the world.
Yeah, I think the Bank of England is full of those people as well. It seems to be that the American government seems to be almost deliberately following the track of the Japanese government of 20 years ago. Do you think this is just going to go on and on and on, grumbling and grumbling like the Japanese situation with capital being slowly destroyed? Or do you think there'll be a big bang moment at some point?
Well, I think there are parallels between what the U.S. did in the 1930s with program after program and bailouts and subsidies and so on and so forth, and parallels with Japan and parallels with what we're doing today. And basically, it's where the government aggressively intervenes in markets in order to prop up those markets. But ultimately, if you don't take your medicine, if you don't go through bankruptcy processes and clear out all the bad debts that can't be paid down, that can't be paid off, you're going to continue to have this sickness in the economy. So the results of Bernanke's policies, and of course our federal government, which is running over $1 trillion in deficits every year, that's going to keep the economy sick. That's the best thing it can do. As you suggest, there could be very easily some big bang event in the economy which would result in much worse economic conditions, much higher unemployment, and much more economic destruction of capital than if we just continue to linger on. But the only way out, ultimately, is take the medicine, to go through the processes, the natural processes of bankruptcy and reorganization, downsizing, right-sizing, so on and so forth. All those business, all those entrepreneurial things that have to happen in order to get the economy on the right track.
I'm going to make you the doctor then, and I'm going to give you a bottle of medicine. What exactly do we have to do to apply this medicine? I'm going to make you the governor of the Federal Reserve. What do you do on day one to start sorting this mess out?
On day one, I walk into the office and I make an announcement that the Federal Reserve is no longer going to target interest rates, and that the interest rates in the economy will be determined not by the Federal Reserve, but by the market. And that we are not going to be increasing the monetary base, that we're going to basically cease and desist as an intervener in money markets. We're going to continue to do all the normal processes that we engage in, the checking system and so forth, the distribution of bills and coins and so forth. So we're not going to close down, but we're going to stop the inflationary process, and we're going to work our way out of being an essential sort of component of the marketplace. And at the Treasury, basically, you have to start running a balanced budget. So you'd have to have pretty massive spending cuts all the way across government, entitlement programs, the military, spy organizations, foreign aid, unemployment insurance. That's got to stop. It's been said that you can get as much unemployment as you're willing to pay for. And we've been paying people not to work here in the United States and other places as well. But that's got to be one of the necessary components of cutting back government.
Yeah, we have whole generations of people here in the UK who don't know what a proper job is. I was just wondering, what do you think the actual real interest rate would be if it was allowed to float freely?
Well, if you're talking about the money market rates, I would say they'd be pretty low, actually. You need at least 2% to get banks interested in putting their money into the money market. So I would say, 2-3% for money between banks. And then for loans, you're talking about 5-6-7% for collateralized loans. And then, of course, it goes on up from there depending upon the risk in the economy. But, a normal market economy is going to be one that's characterized by deflation rather than inflation. So there would be no inflationary premium built into interest rates on loans. There would be, in effect, a deflationary premium on loans, in the sense that people would expect that the prices of goods and services in the economy overall would fall over time as increased productivity resulted in the production of more goods, but with essentially the same amount of money in the economy. So there would be, as you get back to a market economy where the government is not sucking out all the resources and you don't have monetary inflation, you would expect a gradual low deflation, and therefore you would expect fairly low interest rates.
A huge, great crack up, and then we'd get back to a kind of 19th century situation of continuous deflation, gentle deflation.
And, of course, you'd have a restoration of the capital stock. You'd have an economy that was geared towards saving and investing rather than borrowing and inflating. And so, when you have a solid, real capital stock, the economy tends to grow at a faster rate, tends to be much more stable, and you're unlikely to get economic crises in things like stock markets.
Okay, speaking of bubbles and inflation, a while ago you edited and re-released a fantastic book, originally written in 1730 by Richard Cantillon in French. Now, he worked for John Laws, and Mr. Cantillon made a fortune on the Mississippi bubble on the way up, and he made another fortune on the Mississippi bust on the way down. Now, despite being an Irishman who lived in France and more than a century before Karl Menger, do you think Richard Cantillon was the first kind of fully formed modern Austrian?
I think he was the first fully formed economist, period. Before Richard Cantillon wrote his essay, if you look at the writings of economists, they're unorganized, they're non-theoretical, they don't really have any rigor to them. They're basically discussions about economic issues from a personal point of view, from your own personal point of view and your own personal interests, or maybe from moral considerations or ethical considerations in the case of the scholastics. But Cantillon was the first one to really organize a way of thinking about economic issues. And so it's very easy to understand what you're reading in the essay, which I highly recommend to everyone. is an organized way of thinking that's logical and deductive. He basically taught the whole first generation of economists. He taught the physiocrats. They're the ones that first issued his book in the 1750s. He taught Adam Smith. He taught David Hume. He taught French liberals, Jean-Baptiste Say, and so forth. So economics really was just a topic to be discussed before Cantillon, and afterwards it was a science. And so he revolutionized the way the economy is understood, and that understanding, as it spread all across Europe, really helped ignite and extend the Industrial Revolution, Enlightenment thinking. And so I consider it one of the most important books ever written.
I can highly recommend it as well. It's a wonderful read and beautifully written and very nicely translated as well by Chantal Saucier. Now, there was me thinking the whole of economics sprang like Athena from the brow of Zeus, from the forehead of Adam Smith, whereas really it probably was Richard Cantillon and the Scholastics, of course. He made a fortune from the Mississippi bubble, and then he mysteriously died. Do you think he actually died, or did he just fake this and just move away somewhere else where there was less heat on him, maybe to South America somewhere?
Yes, there's a lot of different theories regarding the demise of Richard Cantillon. At first, it was reported as a murder-arson, that Cantillon had been killed, possibly by his servants, and his money was taken, his house was burned down. There was a big investigation, and the servants were basically cleared of being guilty. So that was the working theory for a long time. Cantillon's biographer, Anton Murphy, did a lot more digging, not just of the existing facts, but he went even further. And it's his surmise that Cantillon did not die, but he faked his death and that he ran away to South America, because some of his papers were found in South America. And so there's good reason to suspect that he might have faked his death. He was a very clever man. He was obviously very intelligent. He was one of the wealthiest persons in the world. But people had lawsuits against him. People charged him with crimes because they were jealous of his wealth that he had attained during all those turbulent economic times to become really one of the wealthiest private individuals in the world. However, in my general reading of Cantillon, one of the things that I've discovered is that in all likelihood, his wife, there were problems in the marriage. There are indications that she was fooling around, and in particular, that the person that she married shortly after Cantillon's death was a military officer and a spy and a kind of a rogue person. Cantillon, in 1734, there was a crisis in England where he was living over the excise tax issue. It's my guess that Cantillon was helping to fund the opposition led by Lord Bolingbroke against Walpole and his party. So if you've got the existing government who has a spy who is fooling around with Cantillon, there are multiple reasons to suggest that Cantillon may have been assassinated by the lover of his wife. It's very unclear to me as to exactly how he did die.
I think somebody should write a novel about this. It makes the Count of Monte Cristo sound tame by comparison.
I fully agree. I think a movie on his life would be a dazzling hit. And given the people that he knew, I mean, he knew all of the leading intellectuals of this period.
Your last book was Economics of Prohibition. How's the reception to that book going?
Well, I mean, it's been a big hit. It's been reprinted by the Ludwig von Mises Institute. It's a pretty inexpensive book in paperback. It's, I think, $20. You can get it at Mises.org, Mises.org. As a matter of fact, if you search for the Economics of Prohibition PDF, you can look at the PDF version for free. And so it's become kind of a standard. It's been used in a lot of classrooms, and it's sort of become the standard issue of how to analyze prohibitions in general. The book itself looks at things like the prohibition of alcohol in the 1920s in the U.S., the prohibition of illegal drugs, and the effects that those prohibitions have on not just price and quantity, but purity, potency, corruption, crime, gangs. And it just sort of shows that when you try to isolate and prohibit a little small thing in the economy, it has huge ramifications, all of which are negative. And of course, ultimately, you can't prohibit these goods. They just become more dangerous and more potent, more deadly and more addictive. So what the overall message of the book is that prohibitions by governments of what otherwise would be normal goods in the economy is a losing proposition. There's no benefits to be had. It's all costs. The cost in terms of the criminal justice system, the prison system, public corruption, the health consequences of these drugs. We're losing thousands and thousands of people in the U.S. as a result of these senseless prohibitions. And then, Portugal comes around and decides to legalize all drugs. And, the doomsayers would say that the country is ultimately going to be doomed. But actually what's happened is that all of the social measures that are used to monitor drug use have improved in Portugal. So just as the book would predict, if you legalize these goods, what happens is that all of the social indicators actually get better and continue really to get better. And the more personal responsibility society places on the individual, the more likely that those benefits are going to continue to grow rather than get worse and worse and worse.
Now, that book sounds fascinating, and free has always been my favourite price, so I'll be downloading that to my iPad tonight. Do you have any more books coming out soon?
Well, I hope to have a second book out on prohibition, which is a collection of all of my popular articles on the drug war, and as well as my academic work. And if you go to mises.org and look at the daily articles, I've written a lot of articles about developments in the war on drugs, the recent legalization of marijuana, Proposition 19 in California, and so on and so forth, that have been big hits on our website. Everything is free. We're open, of course, 24/7, 365, and you can actually get free PDF copies of our books. And there's no cost to any of this stuff. So I highly encourage people to become enlightened about Austrian economics, because it makes for more sensible social policy, as well as it gives you a better understanding about how financial markets work in order to position yourself in a better, safer, more profitable position going forward.
Okay, I think that pretty much wraps us up today. So, Professor Mark Thornton, thank you very much for your time today.
You're very welcome.
Subscribe to the Gold Money newsletter at www.goldmoney.com to receive email updates on new articles, videos, and iTunes podcasts from our Gold Research section.
Around is that at present, all of that monetary inflation is creating price inflation in things like gold and oil and other commodities as well. If you look at the producer price index for commodities, you can see it's shot up to all-time highs. The price of gold is close to all-time highs. The price of oil is at a significant high by historical standards. And so when we look at just basic commodities out there, we see that the monetary inflation is causing a significant, much greater than 10% inflation. And of course, the government, as they measure consumer prices, they always have a strong incentive to under-account for inflation. And so they're constantly changing the measure. It used to be a cost of goods index. Now it's a cost of living index, so that as we change our habits in buying behavior.
The information contained in this podcast is an expression of opinion and does not constitute investment advice. This is the Gold Money Podcast with Andy Duncan, keeping you up to date with expert opinion on precious metals and the markets.
Welcome to this Gold Money Podcast on Wednesday, the 23rd of January. Today I'm with Professor Mark Thornton, who is a senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Alabama, book review editor of the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, and the author and editor of many excellent books, including one of my personal favourites, a republication of Richard Cantillon's seminal masterpiece, an essay on economic theory, which I'm holding in my hands right now. Hello, Mark.
Hello, it's great to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Some prominent Austrian school economists, such as Bob Murphy, have recently been criticised by Keynesians for predicting high inflation, even though price inflation, as calculated by the US government, doesn't seem to have gone up very much, even if we look at the John Williams Shadowstats site, where it's not in the kind of Zimbabwean kind of hyperinflation territory. Now, you recently wrote an article on Mises.org which spoke about this. Can you tell us what you said in the article?
Certainly. Yes, Bob had a bet with David Henderson predicting that CPI inflation, consumer price index inflation, would exceed 10% by January 1st of 2013. And of course, Bob lost the bet. The problem with the bet was that it was based on CPI inflation as measured by the government. Of course, you mentioned there's problems with that measure, even measuring consumer prices. But what we found this time behaviors, what happens is that we stop buying high-priced goods that are going up and up and up. We buy lower-priced goods that tend to go down, down, and down. And so the government switches the rising prices, the goods that have rising prices, switches them out of the basket and switches into the basket the goods that are lower prices and falling prices. So it's a very inaccurate measure of inflation in the economy. And so my article basically tries to show that we really are having inflation in terms of prices as well as the money supply. It's just not showing up in the government's measure of consumer prices.
Where are the figures for inflation showing up then, if they're not showing up in the CPI?
Well, as I show in the article, they're showing up all over the place. They're certainly showing up in terms of the price of oil, which affects everybody. As the price of gasoline goes up, as the price of energy and heating goes up, of course, we have to buy less of other things. And as a consequence, the price of other things has not gone up. So you have higher oil prices, higher energy prices. You have a significant high price in terms of gold, other commodities. The producer price index for commodities is at an all-time record high. And so, central banks have been increasing the money supply significantly, and it's showing up in world commodity prices as well. We can also see higher prices in things like artwork, contemporary artwork. That market is on fire, all-time record prices for artists, all-time record auctions. And so money is out there, and money is trying to find a hedge against inflation. And so we're seeing, monetary inflation, people trying to get around inflation.